Next item of business is a debate on motion 22392 in the name of Ian Gray on a motion of no confidence. I would invite all members who wish to contribute to this debate to press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on Richard Leonard to speak to and move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This vote of no confidence in the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, the Deputy First Minister, this afternoon is not about personalities. It is not about retribution for what happened last week with the SQA shambles. It is about the principle of the democracy and accountability of the Scottish Government to this Scottish Parliament. It is about a time of reckoning for a long line of failures. But more importantly, it is about the future of our schools, of our pupils, of Scottish education. The basis of a minister's mandate is clear. The Ministerial Code sets it out. The First Minister is responsible for the overall organisation of the government and appointments. Ministerial appointments are subject to approval by Her Majesty. Before seeking approval, the First Minister must secure the agreement of the Parliament. It is this agreement that we wish to withdraw. The responsibility of individual ministers for their own conduct and that of their departments lies at the very heart of accountable and democratic parliamentary government. We do not accept, under clause 1.6 of the Ministerial Code, that the Cabinet Secretary for Education conducted himself in line with that code. He has failed in justifying his actions with respect to the SQA results fiasco to this Parliament and to the Scottish people. And as a result, Mr Swinney no longer commands the confidence of this chamber. Presiding Officer, at the end of last week, we reviewed the SQA results fiasco following thousands of calls, emails and messages from anxious and increasingly angry young people, from their parents and from their teachers. And having reviewed it, we decided that we had no choice but to table this motion of no confidence. This is not a decision that we took lightly. Motions of no confidence have been laid only sparingly in the history of this Parliament. Of course, the restoration of pupils' achievements based on the assessment of teachers who know them, but more importantly, who know their standard of work inside out, is a victory for fairness, for common sense, and above all, it is a victory for all those young people who refused to take this injustice lying down. What it is not is a victory for the Education Secretary, who only jumped to action when his own job was on the line. Some MSPs may think this means that the Cabinet Secretary is fit to continue in office, but many others of us believe it is all the more reason why he must go. Just yesterday, the head of the SQA told a committee of this Parliament that while she regretted the experience some pupils had had, the SQA had received a commission from the Scottish Government which it had done its very best to deliver, in her words. So clearly, the SQA believes that the responsibility for this results fiasco falls on Mr Swinney. But it begs so many questions about how it came to this. And perhaps the Education Secretary can explain why he did not listen to warnings in April, in May, in June, in July, that this is exactly what was going to happen. And when it did happen, why did he not act immediately? The pupils and people of Scotland deserve to be told what went wrong. The Minister tried to explain. The First Minister apologised, and the Cabinet Secretary was forced to take remedial action. But the SQA exam fiasco is just the latest catastrophe in Mr Swinney's tenure in education, which has seen a catalogue of catastrophes. The failure to meet the promised expansion of childcare, failing still to get the resources to councils for schools reopening, the U-turn on getting schools back full-time. but his time at education has seen a series of other poor decisions, narrowing subject choices, refusing to scrap Primary 1 testing, ditching his education bill, and failing kids with additional support needs. Education is not just a government brief. Schooling is not just a process that young people must go through in advance of going out into the world of work. At its core, education is a liberating process that empowers our young people to strike out and forge the life that they want to lead. At its best, our education system allows for the aspirations of pupils to be realised. It acts as a dynamo for social mobility. So I am pleased that 75,000 young people who had their results downgraded will now receive the mark recommended by their teachers. But we cannot simply turn the page. We cannot ignore the damage done to those young people, the hurt felt following months of turmoil and anxiety, the distress of dreams disappearing, the mental anguish felt by them and their families. John Swinney showed us that he had no confidence in Scotland's school students and teachers. It is this Parliament's duty to those school students and teachers to say that we have no confidence in him to sort out this mess which he has created. For these reasons, I move this parliamentary motion of no confidence in the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills and ask him to go.
Thank you. I call on the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon.
Presiding Officer, I oppose this motion and express my confidence in one of the most decent and dedicated people in Scottish politics. John Swinney is someone who works hard to fulfil his responsibilities each and every single day. But when he gets something wrong, he has the humility to say so and to put it right. In my book, Presiding Officer, that is a strength. The last few days have been more difficult than they should ever have been for many young people in Scotland. I know that, and I am sorry, and so is John Swinney. The situation created by COVID is unprecedented in the history of Scottish examinations. In a unique set of circumstances, we took decisions that we considered on balance to be the right ones. These decisions were, as has been commented upon by others, broadly the same decisions reached by different governments of different party colours in England and in Wales. I'm not going to dwell on that point today, but it does speak volumes about the motivations and the priorities of the opposition in this chamber. In Scotland, 25% of grades were downgraded. The Scottish Government acknowledged the unfairness. We apologised and we put it right, and yet the opposition demand a resignation. In England, closer to 40% of grades have been downgraded, and as yet no comprehensive solution has been offered. But from the Conservatives, we have weasel words. And Labour, who lodged this motion before even waiting to listen to the solution at UK level, are today calling for the same solution as has been put forward in Scotland, rather than a ministerial resignation. Why, Mr Gray, is that the case?
Ian Gray.
Well, the First Minister acknowledged that in Wales, the government has moved to correct the exam results before they were issued to the young people. Does she not wish Mr Swinney had done that too?
I think, if I'm correct here, more than 40% of grades were downgraded in Wales. But my question was why Scottish Labour are calling for something in Scotland that their UK counterparts are not. I think it proves, Presiding Officer, that for Scottish Labour and the Scottish Conservatives, this is not about principle, this is simply about politics. Now, we own our mistakes, so should they. I readily acknowledge that we focus too much on the system and not enough on individuals. A desire to avoid something that would look like grade inflation meant students lost out in grades that their teachers believed they deserved. And the statistical model used meant more students were downgraded in poorer areas than in other parts of Scotland. That was wrong, which is why the Deputy First Minister set out a solution on Tuesday and restored the grades of young people, across, not just now, across the country. And to those who say, and who will quote us in support of that view, that these awards are now too generous, let me say this. I've reflected hard on that point over this past week and come to this conclusion, and I do regret that I didn't come to this conclusion more quickly. Given the enormous COVID disadvantage that young people have suffered in this, I hope, unique year, levelling the playing field a bit in their favour cannot be and is not a bad thing. Now, neither John Swinney nor I have any desire to hide from the fact that we initially got this wrong. We acted from good intentions, but we got it wrong. In putting it right, we have listened and we have learned. We've listened to parents, to teachers, and indeed we have listened to parties in this Parliament more than they have been prepared to listen to anyone else. But most of all, we have listened to young people. They have been impressive, passionate and persuasive advocates for changing course. The Curriculum for Excellence aims to ensure that all of our young people have 4 core capacities. It asks that they become confident individuals, responsible citizens, successful learners and effective contributors. Last week reminded us again how many of our young people have all of these capacities in abundance. The response has shown that teachers across this country and our education system as a whole are doing a huge amount right. They are creating very many, very impressive young people. And, Presiding Officer, we should think, all of us, about what lesson we want to take from all of this. This government made the wrong judgment, but we listened to those who raised their concerns and we acted. We took responsibility, we owned it and we fixed it. We haven't hidden, we haven't tried to blame anyone else, and we haven't objected to the criticisms made of us. Presiding Officer, I accept that the votes in this chamber will probably go today on party lines. Well, I will take a final intervention if I have time to see if anybody on the Scottish Conservatives can explain the dissonance between their position here in Scotland and their position in the rest of the UK.
Jamie Halker-Johnson.
The First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have both apologised to pupils, to parents, to teachers. But has the Deputy First Minister apologised to you? And did he offer his resignation to you?
First Minister.
The Deputy First Minister is probably the most honourable individual I have ever known in my life, perhaps something the member finds difficult to understand. But I think, Presiding Officer, to let me conclude, that those watching outside this chamber, for them, one of the questions thrown up by this motion today is what exactly do we want our politics to look like? Fundamentally, my view is that making mistakes in unique circumstances, acknowledging those mistakes and fixing them is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of a system that works and of a minister who, when a mistake is made, takes the right approach. In the midst of a global pandemic, neither our education system nor indeed our politics will be made better by a resignation over a mistake which has been corrected. And, Presiding Officer, hopefully it's because in their hearts they know that to be true, rather than sheer hypocrisy, that explains why none of these opposition parties are calling for resignations of their own colleagues in other parts of the UK facing even bigger problems. For all of these reasons, Presiding Officer, I wholeheartedly oppose today's opportunistic motion.
Thank you. And I call on Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. John Swinney has been an excellent servant to his party and a huge contributor to this Parliament. There is no reading of post-devolution politics in which he isn't a significant figure. And for my own part, I studied many of the ways he professionalised the SNP as leader. And while the 2003 election didn't reap dividends for him, his management set up his party to win in 2007. When Nicola Sturgeon went into her first Scottish election as leader, claiming that education would be the defining mission of her government, it was natural that she turned to her diligent, capable deputy to deliver. It should give nobody who cares either about the future of our young people or the importance of this Parliament any pleasure to speak in today's debate. But neither does that displeasure negate the fact that the Education Secretary's failings are so great and the damage to his authority so fatal that he simply has to go. Because this is more, it's about more than just the results day itself, as important as that was. This is about the repeated warnings from opposition members that went unheeded for months, the recommendations from the Education Committee back in May about the transparency of methodology that was roundly rejected. It's about the fact that John Swinney issued the parameters to the SQA and the SQA simply fulfilled the brief that they were given. It's that the Education Secretary had the results for 5 days before they were published and could see the car crash that was coming and didn't act. When faced with thousands of students whose dreams were dashed, he dug in and defended the system over the pupils. A system that entrenched educational inequality and meant that for some, there was nothing, literally nothing, that they could do to succeed. And when presented with clear analysis showing children from the most deprived areas were hit more than twice as hard as the more affluent counterparts, he went on the nightly television news to deny it, saying the data does not bear that out, when that's exactly what the data did do. And it was only after opposition parties raised the issue of a vote of no confidence that the government's position radically changed. Suddenly, instead of digging in, it was an apology and a total U-turn. A course of action described just days before as having a real credibility issue was now the way to fix an inadvertent mistake. As high a regard as people across this chamber may hold John Swinney, the timeline of a threat of no confidence and the total U-turn that transpired opens the Education Secretary to accusations that he cared more about his own job than our children's futures. But today's motion, while ostensibly about the Education Secretary, is actually as much about the First Minister as it is John Swinney. Because the scale of this failure is to such a degree that it prompts the question, if this isn't a resignation matter for one of her ministers, then what is? Because there was a Nicola Sturgeon elected to this Parliament in 1999 who would have understood that ministerial accountability doesn't just mean fronting up a U-turn, but it means taking the ultimate responsibility for failings in your brief. And if those failings include signing off a major operation of work that proves so utterly unfit for purpose that it has to be dismantled after thousands of school children have been left frightened for their future, then that means falling on your sword. Of course, not all transgressions require resignation, and all politicians call far too readily for the heads of their opponents. But for parliamentary responsibility, or even natural justice, to work, the sanction must fit the scale of the failure. Nicola Sturgeon understood that in 2000, when she called for Sam Galbraith's job after a much smaller SQA exam issue. Just as Nicola Sturgeon understood in 2010 that she needed to make a full apology to Parliament for lobbying a court in defence of a fraudster, even when senior members of her own party were urging her to tough it out. And there was enough of that Nicola Sturgeon left in 2018 when she withdrew Gillian Martin's name from ministerial confirmations after a historic blog came to light. So the question exists, where is that Nicola Sturgeon now? How is it that she can't see what is obvious, that this failure is so great it demands a resignation? Presiding Officer.
Order, please. Order, please.
Presiding Officer, that John Swinney will survive is not in doubt due to a pact with the Greens. But the parliamentary responsibility is forever damaged by his clinging on, and that's not in doubt either. And there was once a Nicola Sturgeon who would have recognised that. I support the motion.
I call on Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure we could have all foreseen the points broadly made by Richard Leonard and Ruth Davidson in opening, and I have prepared some remarks in response to that line of argument. But before we get to that, though, I'm not planning on any big build-up to a point everyone is well aware of. The Greens will, of course, oppose this motion. And before I get to the partisan manoeuvres defining this debate, I want to explain why. I spent 4 months warning that a system was being designed which would not only treat young people like data points than individual learners, but one which was fundamentally unjust to working-class young people and to those in our most deprived communities in particular. I challenged the Education Secretary and the SQA in Parliament, as did Patrick Harvey. I lodged freedom of information requests and wrote to the Equalities and Human Rights Commissioner once her office became involved. My team and I published our own analysis of the schools most likely to be disadvantaged by the system. We were certainly not the only ones to raise these concerns. Ian Gray did an excellent job of raising them as well. But in Parliament, we have consistently been leading on this issue, just as we have on the fundamentally broken nature of the assessment system in Scotland and the organisational culture of the SQA. When the results arrived last week, we took no pleasure in being vindicated. I'm sure I wasn't the only one who spent Monday evening dearly wishing that I would be proven dramatically wrong the next morning. But none of us were. For days, my inbox was flooded with stories from pupils, parents, and particularly from teachers, heartbroken and outraged over what had happened. I hope we were all inspired to witness the revolt of thousands of young people and their supporters who took to the streets, launched petitions, spoke to the media, and lobbied all of us to have this undone. Without their resistance, I don't think we would have seen the reversal announced on Tuesday. In one particular letter that I received, which was also sent to the Education Secretary, a parent told me how their child had been presented with an award for maths by none other than John Swinney himself, had achieved over 90% in their National 5 and Highers, and was clearly on track to an A at Advanced Higher, but was devastated to be given a D by the SQA. The moderation system was fundamentally designed to maintain the apparent credibility of grades at an aggregate national level. It was not designed, regardless of the intentions of its designers, to award each individual young person the grades that they deserved. And for that reason alone, it should never, ever have been put into operation. But it was, and last week we saw the results. The question was, what were we as Parliament going to do about them? Labour's initial response was visceral, but ultimately vague condemnation, leading the Daily Record's political editors to suggest that it was the Greens leading the opposition to this rather than the Labour Party. And what power Paul Hutchin turns out to have over the Labour Party. As an almost immediate response to his comments, Labour dropped the nuclear option, the motion of no confidence. From that moment, every opposition party had the same choice: negotiate a solution with the government or simply gun for the Education Secretary. Any one party could have secured a fix for 75,000 young people in exchange for their support. But of course, only the Greens were interested in actually fixing the problem. Others simply saw a political opportunity, one that, given today's events elsewhere in the UK, takes on a particularly hypocritical tone. Our MSPs agreed that we would support the motion of no confidence unless the government agreed to implement our proposed solutions immediately. Those solutions were the restoration of all 124,000 downgraded results to the level estimated by teachers, the preservation of 9,000 upgraded results, given it would be a bit perverse to penalise those young people a week later, an independent review into how this happened despite months of warnings, which will consider the issues raised around transparency and scrutiny, and a second longer-term review of the exams and assessment system in Scotland. As everyone is now aware, the government chose to deliver on those demands. The Greens' only priority here was restoring the grades of 75,000 young people who had been treated so unjustly. That is what was achieved. So I find it pretty entertaining that the Tories in particular are squealing in outrage once again at a terrible error made by the Scottish Government, but as always, ducking the issue of their own party doing the same thing on a measurably worse scale in this country's other government. To be calling for John Swinney's resignation, but apparently have full confidence in the disgraced former Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson, really does take some brass neck. The stories from England, Wales and Northern Ireland are just as heartbreaking as those we saw here. I'm rounding off, but if there's time on hand, Presiding Officer, yes.
Davison.
There is a difference, and the reasonable person test that the SNP like to put, any reasonable person would understand that there is a difference between trying to mitigate and put things right before examination scripts are issued and after that it's happened, after you've spent a week digging in and all the rest of it. But in addendum to that, I think he's misunderstood what the leader of the Scottish Conservatives have said. He's come out very strongly to say that, just as he said last week, irrespective of whether it's south or north of the border, pupils should be put...
Order, please. Let's hear the question.
So don't misrepresent the words. He's been very strong.
Ross Greer.
I hope I get my time back in hand, Presiding Officer. Ruth Davidson is trying to give some kind of impression that Gavin Williamson saw the problem that was coming and acted to fix it. No, he did not. Gavin Williamson was making statements to the press saying any attempt to fix this would somehow give young people grades they didn't actually deserve. What is What has come about in England today is demonstrably worse. It is the same error in principle, but measurably, proportionately, quantifiably worse than what has happened in Scotland. No government in the UK is free from blame in this entirely foreseeable and avoidable debacle. The difference so far in Scotland is not only did the Greens use our position to make sure the problem was fixed, but the First Minister and the Education Secretary have both held up their hands and apologised. That doesn't undo the damage. They have a long way to go before that's the case. But if there's one thing that I can't stand in politics, it's hypocrisy. And looking around at the two-faced positions of other parties in this Parliament today, I see more of that than I do a sincere interest in the best interests of our young people. And the Greens will have nothing to do with it.
Thank you. Thank you. I call Willie Rennie.
I like and respect John. He has been a good public servant over decades for his party and the government. He is respectful of us too, often polite and engaging in debate. But I'm afraid to say he is losing the confidence of thousands of teachers, lecturers, pupils, students, staff and parents. This is not just about us. This is about the organisation that he leads. It is right to have government that listens and responds, that is agile and not stubborn and intransigent. But when the policy direction is constantly changing in an erratic and uncontrolled fashion, it has a debilitating effect on that organisation. The organisation just does not know what to expect next and loses confidence in that leadership. That has been happening to John Swinney for years now. This is not just about the exams. The Education Bill, a signature piece of legislation deemed essential, it was later abandoned. The Curriculum for Excellence, an initiative that had political buy-in beyond the government, but was so poorly implemented it has been diminished. Testing, pulling out of international tables and abandoning surveys in favour of individual testing, more akin to the kind of thing that Margaret Thatcher would bring in. This was dramatically different direction from when he led his party in opposition. The decision to ditch blended learning as the preferred option just before the summer recess left teachers and staff flummoxed and angry that they had wasted so much time readying schools. Then the exams, the trigger for today's debate. Others have pointed to the repeated warnings and the alternative options offered, both of which were rejected by the Education Secretary. And they were right. They also point to the distress and anxiety suffered by students and their families and teachers. And they're right about that too. But it was two factors for me that are even more significant. Firstly, John Swinney told the Chamber this week that he was only first aware of the impending issue a week before the results were published. In this exceptional year, when exams were cancelled, when the system was turned on its head, he only made himself aware 1 week before the results came out. That he does not see this as a problem is a major error of judgment in itself. He should have asked before he was presented with the results, when the point of no return had passed. Secondly, was even more recent. When the results were published, he hailed them as a success and rubbished any other process as not credible. Yet he has now embraced that alternative, which he has previously condemned. How can he be responsible for an alternative, an education system, which he has undermined so recklessly just the previous week? However, it is the overall performance of our education system that affects his position of leadership the most. Scotland's education system was amongst the best. International measures judge it now as average. Average. Now, his friends and his colleagues will stand with him. But John Swinney knows in his quieter moments that he should go. And I urge him to go today.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to the open part of the debate. I call Joanne Lamont to be followed by Angela Constance. Joanne Lamont.
Thank you for the warm welcome and thank you, Presiding Officer. My time is brief, but I think it's important to start with some basic truths at the outset. Firstly, is the right and duty of this Parliament to hold ministers to account, full stop. Secondly, we know, and it is silly to pretend otherwise, that it was only when the Cabinet Secretary had to contemplate his own future, rather than that of young people across Scotland, that he took action. We know that the Cabinet Secretary has been guilty of a monumental failure of judgment. And I do note that the Scottish Government has deployed its usual well-tested tactic when the Scottish Government is under pressure. Get the Greens on side and denigrate the motives of everyone else. Now, this approach may give comfort to backbenchers, government backbenchers, although I trust it gives some of the Greens pause for thought. But this usual approach to dealing with the huge issues we face is unedifying and not worthy of good government. We deserve better than people imputing our motives when we raise concerns about what the government is doing. But to the issue, it's worth noting that the government and SQA do not really accept that there's been a problem with the system. Fiona Robertson said yesterday that she was sorry if young people felt they were discriminated against. Young people did not feel they were discriminated against. They were discriminated against systematically and deliberately. And the Cabinet Secretary continues to assert that young people from deprived backgrounds were not disadvantaged. And that it is true that for all the Weasley stat mining that the Minister calls in his aid, they were discriminated and he cannot change that. This is not a one-off. The Cabinet Secretary has form on attacking critics as gloommongers wanting to talk teachers and students down, whether the issue was multi-level testing, standardised testing, on increased limits on subject choices, on limits on the number of courses taken, on access to support for those with additional support needs, all issues which disproportionately affected poor children. All too often, he has chosen belligerence in trying that listening thing and paying attention. And in truth, this SQA fiasco is not first base, it is the final straw. Faced with these unprecedented times, with young people facing unprecedented challenges, what did the Cabinet Secretary do? He signed off on a process that presumed that young people in poor areas had their grades artificially inflated and that those in the least deprived areas did not. He signed off on a process that could not even conceive of the notion that young people could form way beyond the past experience of their schools. And so we saw a system where young people, despite their circumstances, despite the many challenges of learning in a school where many of their peers may be dealing with serious problems, were doing exceptionally well, only to discover that the existence of the challenges that they had overcome were cited as cause to pull them back down. And there was nothing they could do about it, absolutely nothing. John Swinney and the SQA had months to test the consequences of their system and utterly failed. He saw in cold print what that meant and he went ahead anyway. My question is, what was he thinking? What on earth was he thinking? And that is why I have no confidence in the Cabinet Secretary. The job of the Cabinet Secretary for Education must above all else be focused on understanding the power of education, its capacity to liberate potential, and that government choices can entrench inequality or can be harnessed to eradicate it. In these times more than ever, we need an Education Secretary who understands inequality and challenges the assumptions about what constitutes talent, ability and fairness, rather than reinforcing these assumptions in action. I believe that John Swinney, over a number of years, has shown himself to be incapable of understanding the fundamental task of education to eradicate inequality. This scandal confirms it, and he should go.
I call Angela Constance to be followed by Liz Smith. Angela Constance.
Presiding Officer, no one in politics is infallible, and high office, like elected office, is a privilege and it's not a right. So I want to put on record why I believe John Swinney should continue as Education Secretary and finish the work that he has started. I have had the privilege of 6 posts within government, and for about 3 years I served as a junior minister to John Swinney and to Michael Russell when he was Education Secretary, and succeeded Mr Russell into that post. So I know that the job that John Swinney does on behalf of the nation is one of the hardest jobs in government. And because it has been mentioned recently, I read the transcript of the motion of no confidence debate that took place in this place regarding the then Labour Education Secretary almost 20 years ago now. And I concede, I wasn't here at the time, but I concede it is not comfortable reading. But it does exemplify exactly why the then SNP parliamentary group at that time was sitting in opposition. And our approach then did not work for the same reason that Labour's approach is not working now. And despite the distress of young people and the anguish of their parents, in my experience, overwhelmingly, what they sought was not revenge, but a resolution. They wanted the Education Secretary to take responsibility and sort it out. And that is exactly what he did, and in short order. What he didn't do was point the finger or scapegoat others. Because whether in good times or bad, fair weather or foul, John Swinney is a man of integrity, and right now I can assure you that the biggest critic of John Swinney is not sitting over there or over there, but it will be the very man himself. And the personal testimony and courage of affected young people resulted in the Cabinet Secretary changing his mind. This is not a badge of shame. This is strength of character. This is a man with backbone. Politicians may scream U-turn, but in the real world, doctors, nurses, teachers, social workers, business people, and even young people themselves understand that even with the best of intentions, mistakes are made. And what matters most is for politicians to really listen, and when they say sorry, to mean it, and most importantly, to back up their words with deeds. And that's what people have seen and heard from Mr Swinney this week. A man who can put himself into the shoes of others and who conscientiously engages and wrestles with the difficult decisions. And I support his conclusion that our overriding consideration is that we cannot and must not risk our young people, particularly those from working class backgrounds like mine, losing faith in our education system, to be left behind believing that no matter how hard they work, the system is against them. And while exam outcomes in other parts of the UK might be informative and they might be of interest to some, they have never, for me, been the barometer of performance for what I expect of this government, or indeed a defence for the Scottish Government. But I'll tell you this, if Douglas Ross and the Tories had even a tenth of the integrity of our Deputy First Minister, my word, they would be in a different place today. Presiding Officer, this year has been truly unprecedented, but some of the decisions that have had to be taken in education and across government could just lead to more lasting and radical change. And in my view, Mr Swinney, a man of unwavering integrity and intelligence, should finish what he has started. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I call Liz Smith to be followed by Annabel Ewing. Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the many years that I have known John Swinney, and especially in the time that I was privileged to be shadowing him in the education portfolio, he was a man who consistently said that he wanted to be judged by the evidence. Evidence about the outcomes for young people, and evidence presented by teachers who he rightly argued are those best placed to know their pupils. And it's to that evidence that I turn now. On the 21st of April, John Swinney told the Education Committee that it was not a case of saying, and I quote, how a school did in the past determines how it does today. Yet the very next day, that statement was countermanded by SQA. On the 1st of May, Fiona Robertson of SQA said, and I quote, "An estimated grade is not just the result of one prelim, exam or project, but one which is based on all activities across the year. That meant to most teachers that they could use internal standardised assessments to assist with their estimates for individual pupils. But they were also told by SQA that they would take no responsibility for looking at these standardised assessments. That created confusion, something that was raised by teachers at the Education Committee. And then thirdly, regarding the case of the SQA saying, we will enter into a professional dialogue with a school if the shape, distribution or volume of attainment at that school looks very different from how it looked historically. But we were left with no idea if that happened and how many schools were actually asked about any anomalies. But, Presiding Officer, there are bigger issues here too, because this fiasco has uncovered several weaknesses in the system that John Swinney has presided over since he took the education brief in 2016. On the 23rd of November 2016, Dr Janet Brown, the previous Chief Executive of SQA, in her annual session at committee, admitted that there had been some errors in SQA marking. Errors that were picked up relatively quickly as they appeared, but which brought into open some issues about transparency. She was asked to produce the minutes of meetings relating to how grade boundaries had been decided, but the minutes never appeared, only reports into each subject area. In other words, it was never clear about who was taking the decisions and on what basis. And at the same time, there were other concerns raised by teachers who felt that they were often kept in the dark when it came to marking standards required. As I mentioned on Tuesday, SQA does not permit the return of scripts to pupils and teachers, unlike in every other part of UK jurisdiction and many other nations across the world. And as they can also use exemptions from FOI and data protection legislation, it is very hard in some cases to gain insight as to how grades are being determined. Surely, the return of scripts would not only be helpful to teachers' professional judgment, but also prevent inappropriate appeals and lead to much better quality assurance. It is something that Dr Brown said at committee on the 13th of September again in 2017, but it's never happened. And if transparency is the key to raising standards, so too is the independence of the SQA. John Swinney said on Tuesday that politicians have to stand back, and he knows only too well that the current structures have left SQA far too close to government and to the other education agencies. And that has been a serious issue for several years, but again, nothing has happened. And then, of course, there is the additional problem about the data set for schools in Scotland, which is weak, something that was flagged up by the OECD and by virtually every single education expert across the country, irrespective of any political persuasion. Mr Swinney is keen on benchmarking, rightly so, but you can only have a benchmark if there is good data. Presiding Officer, John Swinney tells us that his monumental U-turn on Tuesday was because he had listened to young people, their parents and their teachers. But the trouble is that he has not been listening to, and more importantly, not acting upon the concerns of the education sector for 4 long years. That's why he got the primary testing issue wrong. It's why subject choice is a mess. Why Curriculum for Excellence hasn't delivered as well as it should have done. It's why we had to endure several years of named person chaos, and why he's had to U-turn on blended learning and SQ exams. So it is exactly why John Swinney has lost the trust of the public, and it is this motion in front of this Parliament today which is about this confidence, and we will be supporting it.
I call Annabel Ewing before we move to closing speeches. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it appears that I need to open my brief remarks today by restating the obvious, as some members of this Parliament seem to have lost sight of the scale of this global coronavirus pandemic and the impacts of it. Indeed, the World Health Organization reported just a few days ago that the number of cases of COVID-19 worldwide was approaching the 20 million mark, with reported death due to the virus around the world sadly exceeding 700,000. It is evident, therefore, that we are all living in unprecedented and in exceptional times. No decisions are easy ones for the Scottish Government or indeed any government across the globe to make. for there requires to be a difficult balancing of what can often be competing interests and issues at stake. And so it is with regard to the exam process in Scotland this year. The closure of schools on the 20th of March meant that for the first time in over 100 years, we were faced with the cancellation of the exam diet in Scotland. So, evidently, a different approach was required, while seeking to the extent possible to ensure the integrity of the system. The Cabinet Secretary came to the Parliament on Tuesday of this week at the first available opportunity. He admitted that he did not get the particular approach adopted right, and he apologised for that. He came before us on Tuesday of this week with young people, their parents and their teachers right across Scotland listening in very closely, and he brought forward a solution. Presiding Officer, John Swinney listened, he acted, and he fixed it. Incidentally, today, as I was driving to the Parliament, I heard reports on the BBC radio that there are calls in England for the English Education Secretary to have the humility to do the same thing, further to a nearly 40% downgrading of A-levels in terms of results published today. Presiding Officer, I find it very puzzling indeed that the Labour Party are proceeding with this motion today. That suggests that they continue to prefer to engage in their usual dismal, miserablist, negative politicking. It does not inspire any confidence whatsoever that they wish to put the interests of our young people at the heart of their endeavours, but rather perhaps it demonstrates why there is an increasingly widespread view that the Labour Party is well past its sell-by date in Scotland. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would like to say that I have 100% confidence in John Swinney as the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, that I have 100% confidence in John Swinney as the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, and that I have 100% confidence in John Swinney, the man, a man I have worked closely alongside over many decades, who is of unquestionable integrity and who is second to none in his commitment to public service. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. We are now going to move to closing speeches. Our first from Jamie Green, who's joining us remotely from his constituency. Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Debates like this seldom occur because they are seldom required. They are the last tool in the box for Parliament to express its ultimate discontent with the actions of a minister, in our case, one who is also our Deputy First Minister. And they seldom occur because, in all honesty, they leave a bad taste in everyone's mouth. They are unpleasant because they're usually the end product of a sequence of events, not one mistake or failure, but years of them. A lot has been said today, both in attack and in defence of Mr Swinney, and perhaps valid points have been made on both sides. But this has to be a decision that Parliament takes based on the evidence alone, and the evidence is undeniable. This Education Secretary has provided over a flagship manifesto education bill which never got off the ground, another bill which was challenged by the courts, an Education Secretary who was dragged reluctantly to the Parliament over the review into the curriculum, which had its remit expanded and augmented as more and more fault lines appeared in our system. An Education Secretary is now trying to bury that report until after next year's election, who promised Scotland's parents funded childcare and was repeatedly warned and defeated by this Parliament long before coronavirus that it could not and would not be achieved, who pulled the rug from right under the feet of working families, who promised blended learning, which saw plans emerge for just 1 day a week of schooling in some parts of the country. How can that be acceptable to him or to any of us, who oversaw falls in literacy and numeracy standards and well-established international league tables year after year, who made painful progress in closing the attainment gap in Scotland, who was forced into a U-turn over an exam system which, under his direction, marked down those in our most deprived communities the most. Neither the First Minister nor the Education Secretary have apologised for any of that today. And the defence, what about in England, simply doesn't wash out there in the real world, because the job of this Parliament is to hold this government to account. Every U-turn a result of pressure, not leadership, pressure from parents, teachers and young people themselves. Now, I understand the First Minister's loyalty to Mr Swinney. I have never questioned his personal commitment to his job, because I don't think that serves any of us honourably. But there surely comes a day when loyalty, even to a friend, is strained and tested for the greater good. Today must be that day. If this debate was just about exams, then I would cut Mr Swinney some well-meaning slack. But there comes a point when you have to say enough is enough. Patience is a virtue, but it's limited in supply, more so when it comes to the future of Scotland's young people. 20 years ago, our benches supported the no confidence motion against the government after it presided over similar exams fiasco. But that was just one event, and it was enough for the SNP to call for heads to roll. And those who led that charge, Mr Swinney, Ms Sturgeon, Mr Russell, today find themselves on the other side of that charge. And doesn't it feel awkward? Let me say also directly to the Green Party, who may have been appeased by the events of this week and who will save the day for the government benches, you too surely must accept that this is last chance saloon for Mr Swinney, because actions speak louder than words. Where do your loyalties lie? Is it with the Minister or the young people that you claim to defend and support so vocally? Presiding Officer, in closing, I really take no great pleasure in supporting the motion today, but support it we must, because trust and confidence is what lies at the heart of education. And if the Education Secretary can provide neither, then somebody else must.
Thank you very much. I'm now calling Michael Russell to close for the Scottish Government. Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Jamie Green has just said, motions of no confidence are mercifully very rare parliamentary occasions. They shouldn't be the occasion for random smears, political posturing and paying off old scores, which regrettably has been the norm this afternoon. But instead they should be a careful and clinical examination by means of a very tightly drawn but very clear set of objectives about a central issue: if and when a minister deserves to lose the confidence of his parliamentary colleagues and be removed from office. Now, Presiding Officer, I made exactly the same point 20 years ago when I moved the very first motion of no confidence in this chamber. You were there, and I apologise to those people who were there who are going to hear the same arguments again. Because to arrive at those tests, we need to look at parliamentary experience elsewhere. And although the parties here are not willing to think about what's happening at Westminster today, I am. And despite belief that doing the honourable thing is a long tradition, in fact, there were no such ministerial resignations at all at Westminster between 1917 and 1954. And it was then that the famous Critchell Down case established for the modern age, if the members listen, they will learn something. Some of the circumstances in which a minister should take the ultimate responsibility and either resign or be removed. And in December 2000, in the very first debate, I suggested 3 tests that needed to be applied. First, did the minister fail to act at key times? And I called that the Carrington test, because it was the reason Lord Carrington resigned as Foreign Secretary at the start of the Falklands campaign in 1982. Secondly, was the policy which the minister was pursuing flawed because of the minister? And I called this wait and get the answers, don't guess the results. I called this the Howard test, after the former Tory leader, Michael Howard, who failed to resign despite a debacle over prison escapes. And thirdly, was the minister culpable, but was he or she already out of the way and liable not to cause any more harm? Think of that as the Mandelson test. I'm sure Labour remembers that their Minister Mandelson resigned twice in 8 months. And today we could add a 4th test. When a minister discovers that there's a serious problem, does he or she act swiftly to resolve that problem, taking full responsibility as a minister should, ensuring that at the earliest opportunity they apologise and institute the necessary action? I'm calling that the Swinney test, because he did just that. John Swinney doesn't fail the Carrington test because he acted as soon as he could. He doesn't fail the Howard test because the methodology the SQA used in the way it was agreed was not effective. No. And he does, no indeed, nor does he fail the Mandelson test. He's there and working. And he does not fail his own test, the Swinney test. He did the thing I would always have expected from a man of integrity. He took responsibility and then he took action to make a difference to those affected. So on any objective measurement, applying any objective tests, he has no case to answer. We could, however, apply some other tests, particularly to those who have been baying for his blood this afternoon. We could try the Lamont Gray test. Is the proposer of the motion blinded by bitterness at their own political failures? Yes. Oh, well, sorry, 2 ex-Labour leaders, there's a lot of them about. The Davidson test, the Green test, is the political ambition so great they don't care about the damage they are doing to either the system or the individuals. Or the Rennie test is the position adopted just in an attempt to get noticed. Anyone who votes for this motion tonight is failing those tests. Presiding Officer, John Swinney has shown himself to be much, much bigger than his accusers. The pupils and the families affected, the really important people, have already shown their appreciation of what he has done. And I hope this chamber is listening to them and not to his discreditable and discredited accusers today. And in doing so, this chamber should apply one final test. I'll call it the Glover test, after the Church of Scotland minister in Perthshire who tweeted it on Tuesday night. And these are his words. I want John Swinney to stay. Otherwise, it's a culture where if you lie and deny, you can stay. But if you admit and address, you must go. I would ask this chamber to rise above the noise and unpleasantness of this afternoon. Let's do what I think Scotland wants and apply the Glover test. Let's not accept that Scotland's a country that prefers lying and denying to admitting and addressing. Let's aspire to something better than bitterness and bile. This week, John Swinney, for the sake of 75,000 young people, admitted and addressed. That is precisely what we should want from our leaders. And that is what this leader did. And that is what this Parliament should ringingly endorse today.
And I call on Ian Gray to conclude our debate. Mr.
Thank
Gray.
you very much. Action has already been taken to restore confidence in the Scottish education system. However, there is something else in which confidence must be restored. The notion that politicians, when found wanting in their obligations, should take responsibility and that the buck stops with those who are ultimately responsible. That may be an old-fashioned notion, but it is one that the Scottish people hold dear. It is faith in that basic principle of democratic accountability that will be restored in the chamber today if the motion is agreed to. That's Nicola Sturgeon supporting the very motion that Mr Russell just spoke about in the motion of no confidence 20 years ago in an education secretary who had fixed an exam results fiasco and had been moved from his post as education secretary. So what is the difference between then and now? Well, the first difference is then, I'll get to pandemic, well then 9,000 pupils were affected. This time it's 75,000. The other difference is that in 2000 the SQA made a huge mistake. This time the SQA did exactly what ministers instructed them to do. That's what the Chief Executive told us yesterday. That's what the First Minister told us. And it's what the Deputy First Minister, to his credit, has said himself as well. This mistake was all Mr Swinney's. So that's your first test, Mr Russell, failed. But of course, the biggest difference, yes, the First Minister says from a sedentary position, is the pandemic and the cancellation of the exams. And at the weekend, as he announced his or signalled his U-turn, John Swinney said, "These are unprecedented times and we will not get everything right first time." The trouble is, he didn't get this wrong just first time. He got it wrong in March when he instructed the SQA to protect the system above all else. He got it wrong in April, in May, in June and in July when he ignored warnings this was going to happen. He got it wrong on the 30th of July, when he was shown the results in advance and did nothing. He got it wrong on the 4th of August, when those results ripped like a hurricane through the hopes and dreams and aspirations of a generation. And he got it wrong for 5 more days, justifying what he had done without contrition. No, Mr. Swinney did not get this right the first time, or the second time, or the third time, or the 4th time, or the 10th time, or the 11th time, or the 12th time. And that is Mr. Russell's second test. Failed. And those young people paid the price with their anguish. Surely the minister who made that happen should pay the price with his job. Now, I admit that the Education Secretary's eventual climb down was complete and abject. But then he's had a lot of practice. As colleagues have said, there was a climb down on national testing data, the climb down on subject choice, on the need for a curriculum review. There was the flagship education bill he had to bring to Parliament to put it out of its misery. The named person legislation he managed to lose in the courts and in Parliament as well. It's only weeks since Mr. Swinney came here to suddenly overturn weeks of preparation in schools for blended learning and social distancing and announce to teachers and school staff that they had days to get ready to go back full-time. No wonder the strongest argument the opponents of the motion today have been able to marshal in his defence is that he's not as bad as Gavin Williamson. Presiding officer, we cannot have our education system run on climb-downs and U-turns. We cannot have an education secretary who is good at apology but bad at policy. An education secretary who speaks the language of teacher empowerment, but then orders the SQA to trash teacher judgment, who says he will close the attainment gap and then signs off an award system explicitly designed to entrench that inequality. An education secretary who stands by for a week while pupils facing the worst jobs crisis in living memory coming their way see their futures crumble. Now, let me return to the pandemic. Some might argue that with a pandemic and schools going back, much anxiety amongst parents, pupils and staff, that this is not the time to change the Education Secretary. But think of this. We used to have a full-time Education Secretary and a full-time Schools Minister. Now, we have a Deputy First Minister with serious pandemic response responsibilities, and rightly so, because he is indeed one of the most experienced ministers in government. But he is also trying to run our schools as well. As Angela Constance said, one of the hardest jobs in government. No wonder he has failed. And he has failed. Presiding officer, he's still in post. He fails that third test of Mr. Russell, because he is still there. And this will not be the last mistake. And I say to the Greens, yes, you were part of getting towards a solution for those young people, and that is good. But the next time Mr. Swinney fails, you will own that failure with him. This is no time, presiding officer, for a damaged part-time Education Secretary in whom we can have no confidence. First Minister, if you will not listen to me, listen to that Nicola Sturgeon 2000, who once believed in principles, in the principle of democratic accountability. Accept the motion, remove Mr. Swinney from the education brief, and let our schools go forward.
Thank you very much. That concludes our debate on the motion of no confidence. We're going to move on now to the next item of business. The next item is a consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 22424 on committee membership. Could I call on Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau to move this motion? Thank you very much, Minister. The question on this motion will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are two questions tonight. The first question is that motion 22392 in the name of Ian Gray on a motion of no confidence be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. Now, this is only the second time that the Parliament has had the opportunity to use the new digital voting system. I'm sure that members will understand if I suspend proceedings for a short technical break to make sure that all members, not just in the chamber, but those joining us from their constituencies, are familiar and are able to exercise their vote. So I suspend proceedings.